what exactly are ancient grains? Are they better, healthier? Are they more expensive? Where can you find them? Are they worth it? As somebody who bakes a lot with ancient grains versus modern wheats, I thought I would make this video for you to explain all the differences and the unique features of ancient grains, what they are, and we'll dive into all of that, how they're a little bit different, how you can adapt your recipes so that you can decide for yourself whether it's worth your health and your family's health to get them and to start baking with them. Ideally, I should be able to tell all the ancient grains apart. However, in real life, I can tell you that maybe I can tell einkorn and definitely rye because they have very distinct looks. So I have here, for example, and this is why I've labeled my little ramekins where I have poured out little samples of the various ancient grains because I don't want to mix them up and I don't want to make a mistake. This is rye. It has a grayer color, and it also has a more rustic flavor. Rye is pretty well known. And then we have, where is it? Where is my einkorn? Einkorn is a very small round grain, and it's considered to be the oldest ancient grain there is. I think it's about 10,000 or so years old, and this is the original einkorn. It only has one corn that people started baking with. I think next up is emmer. Emmer looks a little bit more elongated compared to einkorn. It has a really nice taste and it's considered to be the second oldest ancient grain. And then I believe in this sort of hierarchy of ancient grains. We have Khorasan. Often there is a trade name called kamut. Somebody has a trademark or a patent on it. And as you can see, it has a yellower flavor and it also has a more buttery taste. It will actually give all your baked grains a little bit more of that yellow hue. And the most recent one is spelt. Spelt is widely grown in Europe and it's actually really popular in Europe because when you go to European bakeries, you will find a lot of spelt baked goods. Essentially, ancient grains nourished and fed people for millennia before modern wheat even showed up. Now, why do we have modern wheat? The challenge with ancient grains is that, first of all, they are often much smaller in grain size. They typically give you lower yields, so you get less ancient grains out of the same acreage than you get modern wheat. And they can be a little bit more difficult to harvest. For example, ancient grains often have very long stalks and shorter, I forget what you call them, up there, the clusters where the grains sit. And modern wheat has very short stalks. And why is that an advantage? Because in the wind, they don't tip over quite as much and they are much more sturdy because if you grow bigger, heavier grains up on top, they won't topple over as much. And why is that an advantage? Because then with modern harvesting machines, they're easier to harvest. Furthermore, and this is where it all starts connecting with one another, is that modern wheat is particularly high in gluten. And why is that an advantage? Because it makes all the baked goods stick together, create more gluten and rise better and maintain their gluten structure. So instead of something becoming very flat, it actually rises and holds that shape because the particular gluten that the bakers are looking for is the one that holds that shape. So essentially we ended up with modern wheat, which makes all your baked goods a lot more fluffy and stand up a little bit better. Now, having said that, the grain sizes are a lot bigger in modern wheat versus the ancient wheats, is what you get is a lot more starch. So when you look at what comes out of your grain mill, you have the bran, you have the endosperm, which is oily, contains a lot of vitamin E actually, and then you have the inner part of the grain, which is the starch. The starch is what you find in white flour because we typically sift out the bran and the endosperm because the bran gives it a darker color, and that is often considered to be a sign of lower quality, or at least it was in previous times. And the germ is the part that makes your whole grain flour go rancid because it's oily and it might go rancid sooner. And if you sift your flour and you get white flour, that has a long shelf life. So you get a lower ratio of bran to germ, and that actually contains all the nutrients, the fiber, which is really important, and also the vitamins and the oils, the vitamin E in the germ. When the grains are darker, you also get more antioxidants, you get more vitamins, you get more minerals, and other micronutrients. And Asian grains are often higher in protein than modern wheat. And if you're wondering why they're higher in protein but have less gluten, because wasn't gluten a protein? You're right. Gluten is one of the many proteins that these grains consist of, and gluten is just one of them. And gluten is the one that gives it structure, but there are other proteins in it. So spelt has a higher protein content than wheat, but it has less gluten, the gluten-forming proteins, than wheat has. So it is healthier in terms of less gluten and higher protein. And oftentimes these ancient grains have a very distinct, different flavor. And I personally really like that because I love the different flavors versus something that's just really bland and doesn't have any personality, if you will, at all. And having said that, for example, einkorn and emmer have a much lower gluten content. They are often more easily to digest, especially for people who have gluten sensitivity. I'm not talking about people with real diagnosed celiac disease, but people who find that they do better without gluten. And oftentimes when they try specifically einkorn and emmer for a while, they realize that they are actually doing okay on those grains. And lastly, and this is not a conspiracy theory, but most conventional farmers and wheat growers are in for the profit, and they get a lot more profit from wheat because it's also what people want, versus ancient grains that gives them a lower yield, and maybe the profit margins are a little bit smaller and the market is smaller. So oftentimes you have smaller farms that grow the ancient grains, and typically their profit, because they're doing it on a smaller scale, is smaller. And I always like to think that when anything that we buy, any food, any produce is produced for profit and not for my health, then I want to take a closer look at it. This is why I love using ancient grains, because I feel like I'm supporting small family farms and I'm doing something for my health. Now, with that being said, ancient grains are more expensive than if you buy modern wheat products, either whole grain flour or white flour. However, I personally like to look at it this way, that I am adding something. I'm adding the extra vitamins and the extra minerals and the extra fiber. And so it is a healthier product in my view. And I think that's totally worth it for me. And there are various sources. I am a big fan of Grand Teton Ancient Grains, a family farm. These farmers have been farmers for, I think, 6 generations. I am going to leave a link for you below. I think that their grains are absolutely fantastic. They use regenerative farming practices, and it's just a cause that I absolutely love to support while they're supporting my and my family's health. So what does that mean for baking at home? These ancient grains often behave a little bit differently. I would like to say that if you want to get started with using ancient grains, spelt is probably the easiest to get started with because it is the most closely related to modern wheat and behaves the closest to modern wheat. So oftentimes, even if you get white spelt flour, you won't really notice a difference in color or taste or behavior. And that, I think, is a really easy way to get started with ancient grains. Likewise, if you mill your own spelt grains, it has lower gluten content, but still behaves very similarly to modern wheat. And once you feel successful, you can start adding other ancient grains into your baking repertoire. I have been baking, basically I grew up on it and I'm still baking it all the time, at least once a week. I have a whole grain German European style sandwich bread, and I just dump all the various grains into my grain mill. I mill them fresh right before I bake, and because I'm using a loaf pan, I'm not so worried about gluten structure and getting the perfect shape and making sure the bread stays round and doesn't get flat as a pancake, because the loaf pan will hold it up. And that's something that you can do too. You can use a loaf pan if you're not stuck on getting a round boule and that sort of bread, but you're using a loaf pan. You don't have to worry about your dough flattening out as a pancake. And then I encourage you to also play with the tastes. You can always sift out the bran a little bit to make the taste a little bit lighter if that's something that you are just getting used to, or that if you have children and they're tending to be a little bit picky because it tastes a little bit different. But if you explain to them why this is healthier and even maybe point out the differences between the various ancient grains, more likely they'll develop a liking for it because they realize how unique this is. The other thing that I want to say is that if you're using ancient grains for smaller baked goods, something that doesn't necessarily need to hold its shape, but let's say for English muffins or for bagels or for little cookies, something like that, you might notice that, first of all, the dough is a little stickier, especially for einkorn and emmer. They are wetter grains, and they also absorb water at a different rate than the other ancient grains and modern wheat. So there's a bit of an adjustment period, especially with einkorn. There's a bit of a learning curve and just a little bit of experimentation and just a little bit of trying it and noticing how that's different. It is a little less so for the Khorasan and definitely for the spelt. And rye has a very weak gluten, so that one is almost a little bit of its own variety out there. Let me know if you have any questions, and also let me know in the comments. Let the other viewers know in the comments if you have been baking with ancient grains and what your experience is and what you can recommend and what you can tell first-time ancient grain bakers, because I think we're all learning from one another. And if you enjoyed this video, I always love it if you give me a like and if you subscribe to my channel. And thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.